Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Gospel according to Matthew. What we're going to do over the next this Saturday and the next two, is we're going to, in a very light way, look at the Gospel according to Matthew. I mean, I'm not pretending in any sense that we're going to cover every chapter and every verse of the Gospel. But to give an overview of the Gospel and the themes that arise out of the Gospel, and particularly to spend much of this morning on the first two chapters of St. Matthew's Gospel, because it's those two chapters along with the first two chapters of Luke's Gospel that make up the, if you will, the Christmas season from December 17th all the way through the Feast of the Epiphany. The Gospel passages are taken from either Matthew or Luke, and they're either chapter 1 or chapter 2. Up until Christmas, the readings are from the first chapter of Matthew, the first chapter of Luke. From Christmas on, they're from the second chapter of Matthew and the second chapter of Luke. There are 90 chapters of Scripture in the whole New Testament. Matthew and Luke's first two chapters make up 4. That's less than 5% of the New Testament. And yet I would venture that more than 50% of the literature, the art, the music that has been created through the 20 centuries around the life of Christ have focused on these 4 chapters. All you got to do is walk through a museum, and when you come to the rooms that have a religious theme, the images of the Annunciation and the Visitation and the birth of the Lord and the shepherds and the wise men and all of that, they make up the majority of it. There's been an enthusiasm and an interest in these stories. Now, most of the passages of the Scriptures that you and I read regularly are short episodes. Jesus went into this town. There was a blind man there. The blind man said, "I want to see." Jesus says, "Do you think I can do that?" The man says, "Yes, I believe." Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you," and the blind man can see. That's the story. Then the next story is totally different. So there's no development of character. There's no development of plot. There's no development of... there's no real story connected, except at the very beginning and at the very end. The birth and the infancy of Jesus, that story is a narrative. You have certain characters, they repeat themselves, they develop, there's a plot that's there. In some instances there's tension, in other instances there's great enthusiasm. So there's a narrative there. And the other example is the Passion story. The Passion story is, again, a narrative. It's connected from verse to verse and chapter to chapter. You've got a list of characters, a list of actors in this drama, and the drama unfolds. And that's unique. That's unique to these two elements of the story. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Only Matthew and Luke have the story of the infancy and the birth of Jesus, the birth and infancy. Next, Luke's story of the birth and infancy of Jesus is really the story of Mary. Matthew's story of the birth and the infancy of Jesus is really the story of Joseph. In Matthew's Gospel, in these two chapters, Mary is mentioned, but she never appears. So it's a very different take on the story. And there's a very different effort on the part of the author in telling the story. If you open your New Testament, the first thing you see is the Gospel according to Matthew. Now that book that you've got there, the New Testament, that didn't come into existence until well into the 3rd century. So for the first 2 centuries, there was no such thing as the New Testament. There were Gospels, there were letters, there were sacred writings, but they were never collected and put, if you will, in a volume. Now what happened in the 3rd century was that there was a great persecution that took place. And the Christian communities were being scattered. And there was a need that the church, the Christian communities had, is that we're not going to be communities anymore. We're going to be far-flung. We're going to be just, we're going to be all over the place, and we're just going to wander. There's going to be no strength to us as a community. How do we hand our faith on to the next generation? That was the question. And the decision was made by the leaders of the church at the time is we must be able to present to you what they called a corpus, a fixed set of readings that we say are the inspired texts of the Scriptures and that are authentic and that they can be the instrument by which you hand on the faith to someone else. So it was a crisis that produced the coming together of the New Testament. Similarly, the coming together of the Old Testament didn't happen until 92 A.D. The Temple of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. Again, the people were spread all over the place. There was a tremendous upheaval of the Jewish community. And they had the same problem. What do we do? How do we hand on the faith? How do we give to our children and grandchildren the faith that is ours? What are the sources of that? And so the rabbis met in a little town in the southern Palestine called Jamnia, and it was there that they came to put together what you and I know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. But again, it was crisis literature that emerged. We're in trouble, we need to have something in order to hand on. Okay, so this book comes together called the New Testament. There was a little bit of a tussle about it. The church on the east accepted 26 books and the church on the west accepted 26 books, but they weren't the same 26. The church in the east refused to accept the letter to the Hebrews, and the church in the west refused to accept the book of Revelation. And so what they did, as in most instances, you compromise. You take each other's books. And so each one had 26 books. Now they had 27 books, and they all had the same books. When you open the cover, though, of the New Testament, the first thing your eyes fall on is the Gospel according to Matthew. Now, these people who put together this corpus, this book, these Gospels and these readings, these epistles, these were thinking people, and they made choices. They made choices as to how they were going to arrange the material. And they chose to put Matthew's Gospel first. Not because it's the oldest. Mark is older by almost 20 years. Not because it's the finest literary piece. It isn't. Luke is much better. Matthew is there because it was called the catechetical gospel, the teaching gospel. So if someone wanted to learn who this Jesus of Nazareth is, the church says, go to Matthew's gospel. And largely because the teaching of Jesus is more fulsome in Matthew's gospel. I mean, for instance, the Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew. It's not found elsewhere. And so much of the instruction, so much of the teaching of Jesus is recorded in the gospel. So it becomes the catechetical gospel. It was probably written between 80, 85, 90 AD. That means it was written 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The author of the text probably never saw Jesus. What he did is he received the handing on of the teaching of the tradition. Probably was written in Antioch. Antioch was the city, well, in fact, it's in the newspaper right now. When the president pulled the troops out of Syria, which allowed the Turkish to go in, well, it's that nexus between Syria, Turkey, and Lebanon, that where they come together, that's where Antioch was. It was the third largest country in the world. It was a cosmopolitan country. It was a country that involved a lot of trade. It was a bustling entrepreneurial country. So it was written in Antioch, probably around 80 to 85, 90, by a Greek speaker. The text is in Greek. By a person who had a job to do, and that was to bridge some very difficult tensions in the community. The community began as a Jewish community that embraced Christianity, so it was a Judeo-Christian community. And for that first period after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Jews allowed a great deal of latitude as to what Judaism was. And for the first 30 or 40 years after the death of Jesus, Christianity was just seen as a branch of Judaism. It was just a messianic branch of Judaism. And the Jewish authorities, the high priests and the court people, they had no problem with that. They had no problem at all with all this half-breed stuff. But then in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, and so was Jewish faith as it was known. I mentioned before, it's hard for us to imagine how catastrophic that was to the Jews. A little piece of it might be the comparison between our experience of 9/11. Now that really did change our American life, but nowhere near the kind of change that took place in Judaism. It meant there would never be any sacrifice again. It would mean that there would be never any observance of the high holidays at the temple. It would mean the end of the priesthood. It would mean the end of Israel's life as she knew it. You know, a pious Jew had to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the festivals. And they had to take place in the temple, and they had to participate. None of that took place anymore. And from that point on, Judaism became a religion of the household. The primary worship took place, the Sabbath worship took place, primarily at the dining room table. The mother exercised the role of the priest. It was her job to arrange everything and to make sure everything was properly there. The father of the family exercised the role of the rabbi. His job was to teach. And so the Passover supper, not the Passover, the Sabbath supper, once every Friday night, was, if you will, the primary worship, if you will, of the people of Israel. The sacrifice was the eating of the meal, the sitting together. The sacrifice, the making holy, was this family event. Now, people would go to the synagogue, and the synagogue would be the place for education. The synagogue, by the way, does not mean a building. The synagogue is just a gathering. It means that there are a gathering of Jews. Now, what happened is they built buildings because buildings were important for handing on activities, but it's not a building. The synagogue is the gathering. And it must be a gathering. For the prayer to take place in the synagogue, there must be a minyan, and that means 10 have to gather. If you can't get 10, you go home. So, the text of Matthew now comes as the first text in the New Testament. Matthew was trying to help the Jewish Christians to understand that Jesus was not the overthrow of Judaism, but the fulfillment of Judaism. And he tried to help the Gentile Christians understand that they did not have to embrace Judaism to embrace Jesus. They did not have to travel the same way as their neighbors did. And together they were believers in Jesus Christ. Together they had a faith that this person is the Son of David and the Son of God. Now, that was difficult to do. I mean, he had one foot in one camp and one foot in another, and he was straddling this, trying to hold it together. And the text of the Gospel of Matthew reflects that. It's the most Jewish of all the four Gospels, in the sense that it is so important that it connects the old with the new. He's at a pain to show how what Jesus is saying is reflective of what happened before. It's also, though, the gospel in which Jesus reaches out to the Gentiles. It's the gospel in which Jesus includes the Gentiles. It's the gospel in which Jesus says that the outsider has a place inside. And so he's trying to describe the events that occurred in the gospel in a way that would satisfy both groups. Mark's gospel, the first one, the oldest one, contains 660 verses. 598 of those verses, in other words, 90% of them, you find whole cloth in Matthew. So if you read Matthew, you're also reading Mark. Which says that Matthew had Mark's text. Matthew had read Mark's text. He had it before him. He was able to use it. And Mark had an order in which he laid out the story. And that's precisely the order that Matthew follows. Now, he has a lot of other sources that are beyond Mark that come together. And there are a lot of other instances that he describes that are not found in Mark's gospel. But pretty much all of what Mark has to say is found in Matthew. Okay, you open the front cover, and what you do is you find the first statement is that this is the genealogy, the Genesis. This is the ancestry of Jesus Christ, son of Abraham, son of David. And then you've got Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah, and you go through the genealogy. Now, I would imagine if someone came up to any one of us and said, I really want to learn something about Jesus Christ. I really want to learn who he is. I really want to know what you believe. My guess is not one person in 10,000 would start with the genealogy. And yet that's where Matthew starts. And Matthew says, this is really who Jesus is. And you will not get who Jesus is unless you get how he comes through this. How this genealogy, if you will, describes him. So, it's a very curious thing. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Well, that's true. Abraham was the father of Isaac, but Abraham had another son, an elder son. It does not say that Abraham was the father of Ishmael. Abraham was the father of Isaac. He's the second son is listed. Isaac was the son, and Isaac was the father of Jacob. It doesn't reflect that Jacob had an older brother, Esau. Jacob stole Esau's birthright. Jacob was a lowlife. Jacob was the father of Judah. Jacob was the father of all 12 tribes. He had 12 sons. The most famous and the one we know best is the youngest son, Joseph. Judah was the one who sold his brother into slavery. Now what do we have? Technically, the way the genealogies go, it's the eldest that is mentioned. Yet in this genealogy, so often it's not. It's also a story of saints and sinners. It's a story of highly competent and grossly incompetent people. It's a story of truth speakers and inveterate liars. It's a very mixed story. There are 14 generations in the first third of the genealogy, 14 generations in the second third, 14 generations in the third. There's a reason for it. 14 is the name David. Jews don't have numerical numbering. Jews use the alphabet. And so the fifth letter is the D, and then the V would be the fourth letter. So 5 and 5 is 10 and 4 is 14. And what he wants to make sure at the end is that you understand David is the father of this Jesus of Nazareth. It's so important, especially for the Jews that he's teaching, that they understand that this child comes out of the royal line of David. The first 14 are really the story or the genealogy of the patriarchs. So Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar. Tamar is the first woman who's mentioned. We'll get back to her. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Aram, Aram the father of Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Solomon, Solomon the father of Boaz by Rahab. We'll get back to her. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth. We'll get back to her too. And Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So the first 14, the first part of the genealogy ends with David. It starts with Abraham having no land. And God says, I'm taking you from Ur of the Chaldees to a promised land, and I will give you a land, and I will give you a people that will be as numerous as the stars of the heaven and the sand of the sea. And the story of the patriarchs is the story of obtaining that land. So that by the time of David, if you will, the empire, the nation of Israel is as big as it ever gets. It's a sprawling, powerful, wealthy nation, the kingdom. David brings that kingdom together. Prior to the time of David, there were two kingdoms, the north and the south. The north was 10 tribes, the south was 2 tribes. David was king of the north. He comes out of Bethlehem, that's in the north. He wants to unite it all, so he comes and he meets with the people in the south, the people of Judah. And what he agrees to is that you come and we'll all form one nation, and I will move history repeats itself. I will move the capital of this nation to Jerusalem. I'll make Jerusalem the capital. I'll make Jerusalem the place of the temple. I will establish Jerusalem as my city. And so they did. And David puts together this gigantic, effective, wealthy nation. Okay. Then we start with the kings. The next 14 generations are really the generations of the kings. Well, there probably are only 2 kings that are listed that are of any value at all. I mean, the others were complete zeros. The others wasted the nation. And so by the end of the 14 of the kings, the generation, the nation doesn't exist anymore. They've been overtaken by Babylon, and they've been carted off to slavery. The story starts with no land, builds to David with land, moves down through the kings, and once again you have no land. And the third set of 14 are people largely whose names never ever appear in the Bible, except for the first 2, Salathiel and Zerubbabel. They appear in the scriptures elsewhere. But the other 12 don't. They're just ordinary folks, they're unknown folks, they're nameless folks. They're just like you and me. And what they do is they rebuild the kingdom. So that by the time we come to the end of the 14, the kingdom is restored. The kingdom begins with Abraham, finds its flower in David, is destroyed by the kings, and is rebuilt by anonymous, ordinary, garden variety human beings. Now, there's a reason that the story is being told that way, is that Matthew wants to make it very clear that the message Jesus brings, the message of inclusiveness, the message of God's mercy, God's love, that message is meant for all people. That message has no boundaries to it. There's no exclusiveness about it. And so it's important to see that everyday, ordinary people are capable of doing incredible things. And that the faith that Jesus brings is a faith that rests upon the back of ordinary people. The Judaism of the time of Jesus rests on the back of these ordinary people.